Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Rabbi.
Zion's a small crowd today.
Wait. Give it another minute.
Is there a small crowd today or what?
No. The Olam is coming.
Okay. Oh, they're coming in. All right. I'm just inquiring. No rush.
There's a minute left, and the world knows Rabbi Zion is this punctual. So,
all right. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Sukah Daf Chaf Aleph. Quickly reviewing, we have firstly the Machlokes, in which we begin the second chapter with the Machlokes between the Tanach and Reb Shimon on one side, Rabbi Yehuda on the other side, regarding someone who is sleeping or eating under a sukkah. Tanach and Reb Shimon hold that that person is not yotzeh. Rabbi Yehuda holds that that person is allowed to sleep under a bed in a sukkah. It's considered like he is sleeping in a sukkah, dwelling in a sukkah. And the Gemara began on Daf Chaf Amud Beis. And as we will see how these two sugyas are intimately linked one with the other, to quote a Mishnah that we have in Masechtas Ahalois regarding a naturally formed oil. The Mishnah over there is speaking about the dinim of tumas oil, and Rabbi Yehuda opines that kol oil she'ena asi bidei adam, that a naturally made oil is not halachically called an oil for the dinim of tuma. It will not transmit tumas oil. And as we read out the Rashi, it's not just about the fact that it's naturally made. Even if it's made bidei adam, oil is only an oil if while it was made with the intent that it should serve as a shelter, as a covering. And therefore, versteht sich that if something is naturally made, there was no intent in there at all. We're going to continue the sugya today on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. We're going to start 5 lines from the top of the Amud, and we're going to review something that comes up every now and then, and that is the extraordinary stringency of the level of tahara that is needed in the preparation of a para aduma. And as we'll repeat when we learn it inside, that being that the tzedukkim erroneously said that the kohen who's preparing the para aduma may not even be tummy on the level of a tful yoim, so lahoitzi miliban, we dafke were metame the kohen who's preparing a new para aduma, and we took him to the mikvah, but he was still a tful yoim. Lahoitzi miliban shal tzedukim. But now we have to make a counterbalance for people not to think that we can take the dinim of tuma lightly. So there were extraordinary chumras, and that's going to lead us into a statement where we will see that Rabbi Yehuda holds that even a naturally formed oil does have a law of an oil, and that will be a stira between the din that we'll learn today, which will really be a Mishnah and Para against the Mishnah in Ahalois, and we will see how Rabbi Yehuda subscribes to exceptions, how this will lead into a challenge against the dinim of our Mishnah. And finally, we will explain the shita of Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah, that a person is allowed to dwell under a bed in a sukkah because of a new concept, and that is that lo yasi oil arai umevatel oil kava, and that is dafka Rabbi Yehuda l'shitasi, as we will repeat something that we learned on Sukkah Dav Zayin as to Do we want for a sukkah to be a temporary dafka? It should be more of a temporary nature, or do we want for a sukkah to be dafka something that is of a more permanent nature? We're going to have the famous Chazal that afilu sichas chulin shel tamid chachamim tzricha limud. Even casual conversation about Talmud Chacham is something that requires us to study and to learn from. And on the Mishnah, on Daf Chaf Aleph Amid Beis, we will introduce another sheet of Rabbi Yehuda that will invalidate a sukkah whose chach is resting on bedposts. What is the issue of bedposts? One of the approaches in the Gemara is that bedposts, as we will describe, as they are still something that is mekabel tamei, tuma, and we're not allowed to use the davar hama'amid haschach, that which is directly upholding the schach. At least we paskin, at least lechatchila, shitas Rabbi Yehuda is that's ma'akev. It cannot be with something that's mekabel tuma, and much more. Let us start on Daf Chaf Aleph Amid Aleph, again 5 lines from the top of the Amid. After we quoted Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah in Ahalois, that says that if you have a natural oil, as far as Hilchas Tum and Tara is concerned, it will not be able to convey Tumas oil, because an oil is only called an oil if it was made with the intent for it to serve as a shelter, as a cover. There's a stira between Rabbi Yehuda and Alois and the following Shitas Rabbi Yehuda as we have it recorded in Masechtas Para. Let's begin inside. Rabbi Yehuda that kol oil she'eno asi b'dei adam, that if it was not made by man, so there was no intent in its making, is by default it's not going to have the status, the halachic status of an oil. V'neminu have a contradiction against it. And here again, quickly reviewing that being that the tzaddukim wrongly held that the kohen who's preparing the paraduma may not even be tamei on a level of a tful yoim. We dafka were metama such a kohen and we took him to the mikvah, but we did not wait until it got dark. So we dafka used an oil that is tamei betumas tful yoim. But for us not to think that we can take tuma lightly, we added extraordinary stringencies, including, let's read it inside, that that there were courtyards that were built in Yerushalayim, and they were built al gabi hasela, they were built on top of bedrock, in other words, on top of rocks that were unearthed apparently since the creation of the world. And if that indeed is the case, then there won't be a corpse underneath it. Now, can we be certain that it is a sela, that it's version bedrock? No, but at least it's a highly unlikely for there to be a corpse buried underneath it. Now, guys, let's not forget that if you have a corpse buried in the ground, if there isn't a tefach of space and then a proper oil covering on top of it, that tumah will then be called tumah retzutza, and it's boikaas, and it goes up. So if a person or a thing that is makabel tumah will go over it, it will become tummy. But if you build a courtyard that's on top of bedrock, now maybe there is a corpse that was buried there a long time ago, and that goes into the sugya of tumas tohoim that we will review in greater detail another time. So on top of that, v'tachteim cholo. What they did was really, v'tachteim means that on top of this bedrock, they would construct some sort of raised platform. The raised platform would be 1 tefach higher than the bedrock. They built it on top of arches, double arches, overlapping arches. And again, the moment you have a halal tefach, even if there is a mace buried underneath it, it's no longer called tumah retzutza. The tumah will stop by the floor. So you have sela, you have arches, and on top of that, you have a platform. And on top of that, you built a chutzner. And all of that, in other words, why did you have to, on top of the sela, build this platform that is above the ground by a tefach or more? Because of the small possibility of what we call kever hatohaim, which is an unknown corpse that's buried there. And we are even making an effort to avoid that. So it's amazing. So these children were born in an environment where we are 100% certain that they never became impure b'tumas meis. And as we will see, like Rashi points out, they would stay there until they are 7 or 8 years old. They would bring over their pregnant woman. They would give birth over there. Umegadles b'neim shaman, they would raise their children there again until they are 7 or 8. La para means that maybe we will have to make a new para aduma. And if that were to happen, so one of the steps that we will need to do is we will have to gather new living waters. And they used to go to the Shiluach spring. And we want to make sure that the people bringing the water for sure don't have any tumah on them. Now, how do you get these children who up until them leaving these chatzeros don't have any tumah, but they have to now go to the Shiluach spring? So umeviyim shvarim, they would bring oxen, and look at this. Va'al gabeim delasois, and on top of the oxen they would put out a door. In other words, when you go from these chatzeros to the spring water, maybe then, unbeknownst, you're going to be walking over the remains of a corpse that's buried underneath the ground. So again, you want to create some sort of oil that even if you're going to be going over kever tohaim, the tumah will get stopped by the delas, by the door. And these children will sit on top of these doors. And the kalim that they would use are kalim that halachically are not susceptible to becoming tamei, which will be, for an example, now, when it comes to the shiluach, here we're going into another question, and that is whether drawing the water is valid if you are lowering the keli from a higher place, or whether you have to draw directly from the water. So the Tanach holds that yardu lamayim umil that the Tanach holds that it won't be considered a halachically valid drawing of the water if you are mishalshel, if you lower the cup with a rope. You have to actually go into the water. Now, could it be that underneath the water in the spring, somewhere buried underneath, there is a cave? Yes. But it's highly, highly unlikely. But you have to take that high unlikely risk because there's no other way of getting the water into the cup for it to be considered a halachically valid drawing of the water. And right away, they would go back and they would sit on top of the door, on top of the ox. And if you remember, guys, we had this in the beginning of Yuma, that the kohen that's going to be the one preparing the new para aduma, he would actually be sequestered in the Beis HaMikdash for a full 7 days. No one was allowed to touch him, and the waters would be brought to him. Now, brought to him meaning that during those 7 days of sequestration, they would sprinkle on him every day. Every day, we learned, if you remember in Yuma, it's not mamash every day, it's not the 4th day, but other than the 4th day, they would sprinkle on him every day from the mechatos, and these were the waters that were used to do the sprinkling on the kohen that's sequestered. Now there's one weak link, and that is when the child would leave the door, would leave the ox, go down to draw the water, because the Tanach holds that there's no other way, because if he were to lower the cup into the water and then bring it back up, that's called being mishalshel, the keli, it's not considered drawing water. However, Rabbi Yossi holds that drawing water is valid even if he's not putting the cup into the water himself, even if he's lowering it from this higher platform. So he stays on the higher platform. And all of that is because of the highly unlikely, but still there's always a possibility that pumped exactly where the child is going to land in the water, underneath there, many years ago, unbeknownst to anyone, there's a corpse or enough of the remains of a corpse that is able to convey tuma as tuma retzutza. Okay. Now, why did he have to go on a door? What's wrong with using the ox itself as a interposition, that even if there is a corpse buried underneath that path that they're walking from this chatzit until the shiluach, the ox itself can affect that oil. And indeed, V'tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer, that lo yehoya meviyim delasis, we'll see, is it that you did not need doors, or actually Rabbi Yehuda holds that doors are not valid? Ella, we'll see, we'll get to that in a moment, but what was done, the shvarim, the oxes were very wide-bellied, and the children were, so to say, were completely on top of the ox. Between the zaitin of the oxen, there was nothing of the child that was directly over the ground, so the ox itself would serve as that oil that even if they're walking over a caver, the tumah would stop by the underbelly of the ox. End of Mishnah. And now comes the Bamba Kasha. So what did we learn in the Mishnah in Ahalois? What does Rabbi Yehuda say? That if an oil is not asui b'dei adam, and as we mentioned, it's not just that it has to be man-made. An oil, for it to be a halachic oil, it has to be made by a person with the kavana that it should serve as an oil. So how can an ox serve as an oil to stop the tumah tzutza? The oil she'enoi asui b'dei adamu, and yet v'ketani Rabbi Yehuda omer lo hayim meviim delasois elo shvarim. It's a natural oil. It's an ox. Why here does it constitute an oil? Now, if you can just leave somewhere in the back of our heads our Mishnah of Sukah, and we see right away how this is very much related. Because don't forget, Rabbi Yehuda is the shita that holds that a person, let's say, for example, who's sleeping under a bed in a sukkah, he's considered to be in the sukkah. It's 100% okay. He was fulfilling the mitzvah of dwelling in the sukkah. And as we can right away see the link, a bed was not made to be mile for that which is underneath it. Now, if an oil that's not asui b'dei adam, in order, the purpose is not to serve as a shelter or a shade, so then that would fit with the Mishnah in Alois, but as we'll see, the Gemara is going to speak it out on Amud Beis, but here we have a problem. And the answer must be, and Kiyasir Avdimi, when he came from Eretz Yisrael, he came quoting Amar Rabbi Elazar, who lived in Eretz Yisrael. That, the Mishnah in Alois is the rule, and let me tell you the exception. The exception will pose a problem here. Exception is, Rabbi Yehuda admits that if the size of the oil is kimeloi egroif, the size of a fist, and Rashi both on Amud Aleph and Chaf Aleph Amud Beis is speaking about two things. He always mentions the width of the oil, the width and the length, as well as the ear space in between the cover and that which is underneath it. So if it's in the size of a fist, which is bigger than a tefach, a large fist, then even Rabbi Yehuda's Maida, yes, at a certain quantitative size, it will have the din of an oil, which obviously must mean that if you remember at the end of yesterday's share, all of the examples we had in the Mishnah and Alois about naturally formed crevices in the ground, the taka were small. The Mishnah spoke about if there was hollowed out with water or if it was eaten by shiratzim. Well, these are little crevices, little caves, little hollows in the ground, taka smaller than the Emaloi Agrif. And let's read inside a very important Rashi. On one hand, we said we don't quote all of the Mishnayos and of Taras. On the other hand, we did have before a Gufa. It's good to learn Chaparain and learn a little bit more on Taras. So Rashi, 5 line under the Gemara writes like this: Malay Egroif, what's the magic of Malay Egroif? And do we find a parallel in other areas of Tum and Tara that size matters? And the answer is yes. Oil shirachav Malay Egroif, Shuhu Yoisin Mitefach. First of all, you think about an egroif, a fist. Don't think about a tefach. It means a large tefach. It's bigger than a tefach. Moed Rabbi Yehuda. I'm reading inside the Rashi that sha'af al pishe einoi asu b'dei adam, even though it was not man-made, which means it was not made with any intent. It was created by God. We later could attribute an intent to it, but it was not made with an intent. Chashuv liyos oil. It's considered an oil. Because we find elsewhere in Dinim Tumentara that this size, Matzinu Chashuv, it's considered a Chashuv area. Where do we find it? Lema'oir she'enoi asu b'dei adam. So we're going to another halacha that we have in Ahaloi. So let me just say this by heart. What happens, this is very practical. If you have a source of tuma in one room, you have a corpse. Now, everything under the same covering becomes Tami B'tumas oil. What happens if there are people or things or food or mashkin in next door, in an adjacent room? The halacha is, guys, listen to this, is that if there is an opening between one room and the other, then the tuma goes from one room to the other. Now, how do you define an opening? So there we learned like this, that if between these two rooms, a person drilled a hole, a person created an opening in order for ma'od, in order for light to come in. Since it was made by a person with that intention, so even if the opening only has the size of a pudyon, right, that small coin, it will make the tumah from one environment to go into the other. However, what happens if the opening, if the window was not man-made? There we also find the halacha that even if it's a natural opening, if it's in the size of an egg roif, it will also allow for the tumor to pass from one environment to the other. Gavalda Karashi. And that is all the backup and the explanation to that which Rabbi Lazar said. So enachanami, oil that's not asibi de adam, if it's very small, without that intent, it won't be chashiv enough for it to be an oil. But the moment it was the size of a maloi egg roif or bigger, then it will always be considered an oil. And indeed, an ox, the underbelly of an ox is humongous. It's bigger than the maloi egg roif. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda holds, again, we'll see either you don't need a delis or dafke not a delis. The ox itself is the solution. And back in the Gemara, and indeed, the Gemara says that after we heard it from an Amoidim, we later found a Tana Befedish, Tanya Namiyachi, that Amoidim Rabbi Yehuda, we're going back to Ahaloist. Even though Rabbi Yehuda said, where we learned again in the bottom of Daf Chaf, that all of these small openings in the ground that have an oil under them doesn't have a status, it doesn't have a din of an oil, because it's not Asu B'dei Adam, but Rabbi Yehuda's Maida, Bashe Kifin, that when you have uprooted boulders, large rock crevices, in other words, that crevice, that opening inside is larger than the ones we mentioned yesterday, even though they're not made b'dei adam, they will have a din of an oil. And if you have a kazais basin min mace or any other amount of the mace that could convey tuma through tumas oil, then yes, anything else that could be that is susceptible to becoming tamei will become tamei. Okay. Now again, before we come back to Sukah, we have to work out Pasha to understanding Rabbi Yehuda in Para. Like, why was he against using a door? So frekti Gemara, v'harei deles the yesh kama egroif. I mean, you can argue maybe that a delis is not good because a delis was not made to serve as an oil, right? A delis was made to stand vertically. It was not made for you to take it off the house and for you to lay it down horizontally. But who cares? Now that we just said that even Rabbi Yehuda, the moment the oil has a certain size, which is the maloi egroif or larger, it will always have a din of an oil. Yet v'katani Rabbi Yehuda Ayman. Now, why not? Why not? Before we learned Rabbi Lazar, we had no kasha, because the answer would be because a delis was not made b'dei adam for an oil. It's made for a delis. But now we're saying it doesn't make a difference. So Amar Abaye, all what Rabbi Yehuda means to say in the Mishnah and Para is not that a door is not going to function as an oil. It will. I was not made l'shem oil. I don't care. It's big. It's maloi egroy for bigger. Rabbi Yehuda is saying that you don't need to bring a door. Correct. You already have the ox. So why do you have to bother bringing a door? The ox itself is going to serve as an oil. Rava Amar, however, Rava argues with Abaye and he says nisht. And he says, Daf cannot. A delis is not called an oil, but not because halachically it's not called an oil. Don't use that when you transport a child. It is an oil. Nervous then, when a child is on an ox, but he's not directly on the back of an ox. He's on top of a door that's on top of the back of an ox. So the child feels more confident that he will not fall off. It adds to the security, to the feeling of security of the child. You know, if you're riding on top of an animal and you feel very safe, especially a child, you might become curious and you might lean over to look at that which is underneath you. And the moment the child leans over, then not the shiur is there to interpose. If there is a tumah underneath, not the door is there because he's leaning over. Shema yoitzi roishoy oyechad meivarev v'itame daf chaf aleph. And again, of course, we're not walking this child through a cemetery, but the whole fear is a very small fear. You know, there's a very small chance that maybe it's bekever at home. There was someone buried there that no one knows of, and they're walking over it right now. And now 1 second. And what happens when you don't use the door? So it's a technical thing that when you put a child on the back of an ox, in other words, he doesn't feel as safe. He clings. He hops onto the ox better, and he won't feel safe to lean over. which is what we're looking for, which will make sure that there will always be an ox interposing between the child and the ground underneath him. And now we have a machlekes hadal Pshat and Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, Tanya Kavosi de Rava. Rava says, not like Habaya that a door is good. Loi hoyu tzirichin. No. Rabbi Yehuda meant don't use a door. That it says in a Braisa, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Loi hoyu meviyim the losis kolikir. Don't bring a door. And not because of the dinim of an oil. The door theoretically is a fantastic oil. Elamam mepnei shadata shaltinik gasa olive. He becomes very overly confident. And once he feels very safe, he might not stay on top of it. He might start leaning over. Shema yotzi roishu echad meivarav and v'yitama b'kavanatohim. So therefore, you don't bring a door. But on the other hand, guys, you don't want to bring the skinny little ox because you want to make sure that even the legs of the child, that there isn't a part of the child that's hanging over or that is above the ground directly. So you would bring shavarim that come from Mitzrayim. What was unique about the Egyptian oxen that shekreisoisehem rochavos, that their bellies were very wide, and the hatinoikos yoishvin al gabeim, and the children sit on top of them. And again, this detail again we have in the Mishnah, we have here in the Braisa. It's not only about the child being guaranteed that the child did not acquire tumah, but whether you're going to go down into the water, whether you don't need to go down into the water, the keli is going to go into the water. Well, maybe the keli is going to be over kever hatahoim, so you would bring a keli that's made out of a material that even if it's directly over a corpse, it will never become tamei, and that will be, as an example, koisois shel even. There are other materials. If you have earthenware that was not put into a kiln, if you have a keli that's made out of dung, and other materials. But the example is a koishel even, biyadeyam. Higiyu l'shiluach. Once you come to the spring shiluach, here again, Rabbi Yehuda, not like Rabbi Yossi holds, that if he would not to descend into the water, if he would simply only lower the cup with a string, with a chain, that won't be considered a halachically valid drawing of the water. So this is the only weak link, ein breda. Because you don't have an option, you have to go down. Yardu, the child would go down, and when you're in the spring, there's even a lesser of a chance that underneath it, someone is buried. Umilu'am, and he would fill up the cups. Va'alu, and he would go back, and from there he would not go back to the chutzner. From there he would go into the Beis HaMikdash complex, in which you have the kohen that's being sequestered 7 days prior to shechting and preparing the para aduma. And one of the many steps you did to that kohen was you sprinkled on him from the old ashes, right? All of the 7 days, or almost all of the 7 days, and these waters were used for that sprinkling. And v'yeshvu lahem al gabei. Okay, so at Khan, we brought the Mishnah in Alois, which without even the Gemara speaking, was really self-understood, that Rabbi Yehuda says that you can dwell under a bed. Well, of course, you would say, Rabbi Yehuda says in Alois that it's not even called an oil, because it's not made for shelter underneath it. And I know we can counter-challenge it as we will. Problem is, now that we brought the Mishnah of Rabbi Yehuda and Para, and we made it clear that it's not that Rabbi Yehuda always says that if you have an oil that's eino asi b'dei adam, or more importantly, negeh to the Sukah, that if an oil was not made with the intent for it to serve as a shelter or a cover for that which is underneath it, Rabbi Yehuda says it's never an oil. It's not true. Rabbi Yehuda only says that if it's very small. The moment you hit the size of an egg roif or larger, whether it was made naturally, whether it was made b'dei adam for another intention, we're putting it all together, it will have a din of an oil. So now, how do we understand the Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah? A bed. The yesh ba kama egroifim. Here again, Rashi says it's both many egroifim wide, and you have the space of many egroifim from under the bed till the ground. Whichever way you want to apply the measurement of an egroif, and it's kama egroifim, which means that Rabbi Yehuda will consider the area under the bed to be in a tented area. You are in an oil. Well, if you are in an oil under your bed, now we have the kasha. Yet v'tanan, that Rabbi Yehuda Omer, no hagin hoyinu, was common practice that what? Shehoyinu yishenam tachas amita b'fnei hazakenim. And yeah, we were talking younger than them, but the fact that the zakenim did not respond to us, that was Rabbi Yehuda's raya, that there's nothing wrong with dwelling under the bed because you are dwelling in the sukkah. How are you dwelling in the sukkah? If you are dwelling in an oil, doesn't the oil separate you from the sukkah? Answers the Gemara, no, bed is different. Shani mita hoyel v'legabo asuya. Since the bed was made for it to be used for the top, you sleep on top of the bed or you sit on top of the bed. So it's not that there is no kavanah. It's a negative kavanah. It was made dafka for it not to be an oil. Once you have that intention, it was made for it to be used as a bed, then the area underneath it won't be called an oil. Hold on. Says the Gemara, what about oxen? Shuvarin nami delegabon nasuyim. Right? An ox was made, that's amazing. Here we're using God's kavanah, so to say, or the usage of the ox, the kavanah that the human being gives to nature. And that is, people sit on an ox. It was not made for it to be used underneath it. So the Gemara says, Ki Asar Ravin, Amar Rebbe Lazar, another detail from Rebbe Lazar, that it's not true, that even though people primarily use the ox to ride on, but there is a function that we give to the underbelly of the ox, and we use it as a shade and a shelter. And Shani Shivarim, Hoyul Umaginim Al Horoyim, that shepherds commonly will go under the belly of the ox. Why? Either during the summer when the sun is pounding on you to protect yourself at least from the sun, to get some shade, or when it's raining, for you not to get as soaked, you're under the ox. So since it's also used as a shelter, it serves as a function to stop the tumah tzutza, and it stops the tumah from going further up. And here we have another problem. So hold on. Moida, bed was made for a bed, for people to sleep on top of it. But if you're telling me that if it is used also for underneath it, then we give it a secondary usage. Well, a bed will also have a secondary usage. And what is that? Guys, we learned in Bava Basra that food should not be put under a bed. On it. That's food. You have to be careful. But it's common. People go to sleep. They put their shoes under the bed. They put their sandals. They put their slippers under a bed. So you have to. So the bed also is being used, or the underbelly of the bed is being used as an oil. So we're back to our kasha. And Rabbi Yehuda, because of its size, should consider this a bona fide oil. So why isn't that considered an interposition between the person and the sukkah? How are you yoytze the mitzvah of dwelling in a sukkah? Elo amarava shani shuvarim. The difference is that we look at the primary function. We look at the primary function. Just because sometimes people will use the underbelly for shade from the chama or from the rain, that's not enough for you to consider it. That does not make the shiur a oil. You know why it's called an oil? The way God built the structure of an ox, there is a spinal cord, and there's a rib cage, and then there's skin, that the back of the shiur is there to make sure that which is in it, that the inner organs stay protected. We're not talking about the area under the ox, but we're speaking about in the ox itself. Don't tell me that the ox was made to be for people to go on top of it. No, the ox was built in a way that the top part of the back is here to protect that which is underneath it, that which is inside of it. And we're quoting a pasuk. Now, this pasuk is regarding the formation of man, but we are comparing in this aspect beast to man, animal to man. And what did Iyov say? That oir ubasar talbisheni, that God with skin and with flesh you clothed me, uba'atzamois beginnen, and with bones and sinews to soichecheni you sheltered me. Mamish, the word of schach. So there's a certain amount of sheltering and protection that the outer part of the body affords to the inner part of the body. So a secondary usage won't change its designation. The bed is made for you to use the top. fact that sometimes people also use it secondary to put stuff underneath it has no effect. The reason why a shiur is an effective oil, l'shitas Rebbe Yehuda, and that's because, because so to say, when God made the shiur, the upper part of the back, the spinal cord and cage and skin and hide is made by God to protect that which is inside of it. So that's why it's considered an oil from Tumah Tzutza and not allowing it to go up and being metame, the person, the child that's underneath it. Or the Gemara says, I'll tell you better. The usage of beds also to give some sort of protection or shelter of one's shoes or sandals will designate the bed as an oil. The bed is an oil. So we're back to our kasha. Why does Rabbi Yehuda allow for people to dwell under a bed during the holiday of Sukkah in a sukkah? So he says, Gavaldik, that Rabbi Yehuda latame. Now this is amazing. So let's take a step back. The first Mishnah in Sukkah, Rabbi Yehuda holds that a sukkah whose schach is over 20 amas remains kosher. And we had three opinions on Daf Beis Amud Aleph. And the third one, I think it was Shitas Rava, who was explaining the shita of the Chachamim in the Mishnah. That why do the Chachamim say that if it's higher than 20 amas, the sukkah is psula, the schach is psulas, because generally for you to make such a tall frame, for you to put the schach above 20 amas, then the walls will have to be juicy, good, permanent walls. And the Chachamim dafke want for the sukkah to be of a more temporary nature. And what about the Rabbi Yehuda? So on Daf Zayin, when we quoted many Tanoim that hold the same svara, they don't say exactly the same thing, but they are based on the same premise. Rabbi Yehuda dafke wants the sukkah not to have a temporary nature. The sukkah should be dafke built in a way where it's more like a keva, something of permanency. So, and that's whether your sukkah is that solid or not, since Rabbi Yehuda holds that what? That sukkah diras keva bo'inan, that we want for the nature of the sukkah to be like a permanent dwelling. We are machshiv the sukkah halachically like a diras keva. Makes sense. Oil is something very temporary. And v'havalei mita, yeah, you're right, mita is an oil. But it's for sure considered the diras arai, especially it's such a secondary use to be underneath it. And the sukkah is oil kava. And therefore, oil arai umavatal oil keva, which is fantastic. And that already explains, the Gemara doesn't have to speak it out, that according to the Tanach, since the Tanach holds that the nature of the sukkah has to dafka be of a temporary nature, even if you ended up building up an iron wall sukkah, doesn't matter. It's halachically considered something temporary. So then an oil, which is also temporary, is more in the league of a sukkah. And therefore it nullifies for those who are underneath the bed, they're no longer in the sukkah. An oil arai could be mavatal a sukkah's arai. But dafke Rabbi Yehuda l'shitasai, who holds again that a sukkah has to be a oil keva, an oil arai is considered insignificant, and therefore it does not create an interposition. Fantastic. Now it's not that fantastic. Why is that not that fantastic? Because if you go back to Daf Zayin, one of the many Tanoim that we quoted in the same part was the Tanach Rab Shimon. And that Tanach Rab Shimon was regarding another machlokes. What is the minimum amount of walls needed in a sukkah? So we paskin, taka like the Chachamim, that it's three, but halacha l'Moshe Sinai, that one of the three only needs to be a tefach, 2 and a tefach. What about the Tanach Rab Shimon? Right? He holds that it has to be 4. Yeah, halacha l'Moshe Sinai, one wall only has to be the size of a tefach, so it's 3 and a tefach. And the Gemara and Daf Zayin explained that what's underlying Rab Shimon, he also subscribes that an oil has to be of a keva nature. It has to be of a more permanent nature. And therefore, Pashut, 4 walls is more permanent than 3 walls. But here's the problem in our Mishnah, because in our Mishnah, it's not Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda. It's Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon against Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon holds that you may not dwell under the bed. Why not? Since if the logic of Rabbi Yehuda is because he subscribes to a sukkah being something that's considered keva, Rabbi Shimon, the Amanami sukkahs dira keva bo'inan, which is why he holds. The Gemara says on Daf Zayin that the sukkah has to have dafka 4 walls, 3 walls and a tefach, or as we explained, midrabanan 3 walls and 7 tvachim. I v'ha asi or v'asi oil arai. umevatel oil keva, and that was the whole story of Rab Shimon that learned from the story of Tavi that only Tavi is allowed to live under the bed because he's not mechuyev to sit in the sukkah. So the Gemara says, hold on, you're right by saying that Rab Shimon, like Rabbi Yehuda, both hold that the sukkah halachically has the status of a diras keva. But who told you that a diras arai is unable to interpose a diras keva? Who told you that? That itself, that is the machlokes tanoim, that indeed either in or without the in, that's the machlokes. Machlokes is not about the status of the sukkah. The status is about how much of an arai, how much power does something that's arai have to consider it a separate environment or to interpose between the oil, between the diras keva. Marsover, that's Rab Shimon, that osi oil arai, even though it's arai, and it has the power to be mevatel oil keva. And I'll tell you, perhaps, al pi Chasidus, don't forget that Rab Shimon, Stam Rab Shimon in the Mishnayos and Braisos is Rab Shimon Bar Yochai. And al pi Pnimiyos Onyanim, everything is temporary. Everything is temporary. A little bit more temporary, a little bit less temporary. There's no keva. The God is keva. Everything else is nothing. Maybe that's why. So I don't care that there are many madregas, but it's all really only temporary. However, Rabbi Yehuda holds that no, Chitzoni is not that way. Rabbi Yehuda holds that lo yosel oil aray u'mevatel oil keva. Well, again, that's why Rabbi Yehuda will hold that you fulfill your yoitze by dwelling under the bed in the sukkah. Gewaldig. Okay, weiter.
Rabbi, can I ask two questions?
Sure.
Why are we saying a mita is kva, is arai? It would seem to me that it's a fixed structure, no?
So as we'll see in the next Mishnah in a couple of lines, it's not about the fixture itself. It's not fixed in its place. That makes it for sure less permanent than a sukkah, which is generally connected to the ground or laying on the ground.
Okay. And then the other question is, why don't we just invalidate the oil under the why are we even I like there's no chamas on maroon there's no it's all shade under the oil, right? Like, why don't we just say it's not allowed on that basis?
Because I'll ask you a question, Yaakov. If I'm in a sukkah and I have a cap over my head, or if I have a hat over my head, a very wide brim. Let's say it's 410. You know, the style of our Borsalino hats went from very narrow to very wide. No one will say that you can't eat with that hat on your head. It's 4 tfachim. You're in your garment. Good, Michael. Amar Rab Shimon, okay, going back to the Mishnah, says that on Rab Shimon, I'll prove you come with a Maisa, I have my own Maisa. Maisa Betovi, who was the Eved, if you remember, of Rabban Gamliel, and from that conversation, we extrapolated, that only because an Eved is not obligated in a sukkah, that's why he was allowed to dwell under the sukkah. And indeed, Tanya, we learned in a Braisa, that Amar Rab Shimon, Misichasoi shel Rabban Gamliel. Sicha means from the casual conversation, right? Not midiburai, which is the normally used term, but Misichasoi shel Rabban Gamliel. Lomadnu, here we break it down more than in the Mishnah. Shnei devarim. Number one, Lomadnu sha'avadim pturim in asukah. Tzfas asesha azman gedama. And Lomadnu sha'hayoshim tachas amita lo yotze yedei chavos. He was allowed to do it only because he was an Eved. Okay, and so asks, the Gemara is just being medayik, that why did Rab Shimon say misichasi from the sicha? Why did he, sicha means, sichas chulin, means casual conversation. Why not from the, from the dibur? V'leimen midavarav shel Rabban Gamliel, answers the Gemara, milsag avurcha kamashmalon. We're teaching you something on the side, that kihada amar Rav Acha bar Ada, or v'omri ra amar Rav Acha bar Ada, amar Rav Hamnuna, amar Rav, from where do we know? That even from casual conversation, not sichas kodesh, sichas chulin, tzricha limud, we have to study what they're saying, because in there we're going to learn. Shneimar, as it says in Tehillim, regarding the tzaddik, the tree that's living near the water, that such a tree, it says in the pasuk ve'olehu, and its leaves lo yiboil, will not wither. and leaves, which is the lightest part of the tree, is a mashal to sichas chulin. It's not the learning Torah, it's not the observation of the performance of the mitzvahs, it's some sichas chulin, since it's coming from a Talmud Chacham. And indeed, from that sicha of a Rabban Gamliel learns Rab Shimon like the Chacham, like the Tanakama against Rebbe Yehuda. And here, Chavra, let's learn the final Mishnah on Daf Chaf Aleph, and this will be the source of a very practical halacha that we paskin at least lechatchila, not to put the schach on something that is makabel tuma. That which is makabel tuma is not the schach, but you don't want, for example, in these metal framed sukkahs, which is an item that is susceptible to becoming tamei, you don't want, at least not lechatchila, for the schach to be laying directly on that metal frame. And this comes from this Mishnah. Says the Mishnah. Now the case here is that a person has bedposts. Now you have proper bed. We're speaking about bedposts or sides of the beds that are 10 tefachim tall or taller. And normally you have that horizontal plank or strings upon which you put the mattress. That was removed. So all you have is these sideboards. Now, yes, normally pshutei klei are not makabel tuma, but if they are a keli, they're makabel tuma, and that's considered a proper bed. So even though you took out the whatever was used to hold the mattress was removed, and that's the way Rashi learns the Mishnah, it still, according to everyone, remains an item that it is susceptible to becoming tummy. But don't forget, you're not using that as the schach. You're just using it as the outer structure, as the walls of a sukkah. And indeed, hasoymech sukasoi. Sukasoi means your schach. You lean your schach, you put your schach directly bekarei hamita, on these posts of a bed. So the Tanakama says that 100% okay. The bed is considered a keli. So what? However, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, im eino yechoila la'amoid b'fnei atzma. I don't care if the walls are makabel tuma. If you're going to, aside of the walls, right, you're going to have some sort of freestanding frame, a freestanding frame from materials that are not makabel tuma. If that will hold up the schach, then of course you can use the bed, the sides of the beds, the planks, to be walls. There's no problem with the walls being an item that's makabel tuma. But if you don't have this freestanding frame, so the schach is leaning directly on the karei hamita, so it's ma'amid, something that's makabel tuma is being maimed, holding up directly the schach. Rabbi Yehuda holds it's invalid, even b'di'evet. So holds Rabbi Yehuda. Now, my Talmud Rabbi Yehuda. So says the Gemara, Pligabar Rab Zera v'Rab Abba Bar Mambo. There's two ways of understanding Pshat in Shitas Rabbi Yehuda. One of them say Mipnei she'ein lo keva, nothing to do with what we mentioned, Maimed. One of them says is because since the bed lacks fixedness, and this is Yaakov to what you said before, Rashi writes clearly, since people move a bed around. And again, Rabbi Yehuda l'shitasei, says Rashi. Rabbi Yehuda is the one that holds that we want for the sukkah to be viewed as a diras keva. That's why if it's not even inserted, it's not only, it doesn't have to be pegged into the ground. But a bed is a bed. People schlep a bed here, people schlep a bed there. A bed by nature is a movable piece of furniture. It has no kvius. So that's why it's not valid. And the other one of these two Amiroim say, like we explained the Mishnah, and let's read inside the Rashi. And Rashi writes, don't forget that the psulim that we learned in the first Pedic, the three psulim, one of them is that it cannot be something that's susceptible to becoming tummy, was taka only regarding the schach, not regarding the walls. We know that. But if the schach is directly on something that's makabel tuma, it's on the maimed that's makabel tuma. Rashi writes, "Have a ki'ilu sichech b'davar hamakabel tuma." It's as if you're using something that's makabel tuma for schach, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda holds that it is psula. Now the Gemara wants to know what's the nafkamina practically between these two understandings. Bishitas, Rabbi Yehuda, my benayu. The Gemara gives a great my benayu. If you have freestanding, if you have metal pegs, and a shapud, these spits, metal spits are considered the keli. What happens if the schach is laying directly on it and they're stuck into the ground? That means they have fixedness. Very similar to the frames of the cheap sukkahs you build today, the ones that you buy and you put up. It's metal and it's relatively fixed. So Laman the Amar Lefisha MERCAVA, if the reason of Rabbi Huda, the reason why you cannot use this Kare Hamita is because a bed is a movable piece of furniture. Well, if you are using Shapudim Shal Barzel and they're inserted in the ground, they're very fixed. It will be good. But according to the one who understands the reason of Rabbi Yehuda, the guys, the first wide line and bottom of the Amit, it's not about fixedness or the lack thereof. I don't care if it's fixed in the ground. It's a metal shapud. It's something that's considered halachically a keli. And Rabbi Yehuda will still hold that it is possible. And Abaye adds another detail.
Rabbi,
yes.
can I ask a quick question here? With the metal sukkahs that we have today, so most people, they try and put a wooden piece above the top so the schach doesn't sit directly on the metal. But is the problem here we're saying that any walls that's Mekabel Tumah cannot be used as the wall of the sukkah? That's the opinion that we're learning right now?
Well,
or it's only that the schach is not touching it? What are we talking about here?
Only it's the case of the Mishnah is that the schach is fully resting on the walls.
What about the metal stakes or skewers, the long nails that you...
Shapudim shal barzel. That's something that's Mekabel Tumah. You have to know.
And therefore?
Huh?
And therefore,
according to the Amoira that understands that that's the problem with Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's going to be possible. Let's finish reading the Gemara. Amar Rabbi says, he wants to make it clear again that the problem is that the schach is pashut resting on the bedposts. But if, like we mentioned in the Mishnah, but if the schach is going over the bedpost are serving as walls, but it's not resting on it, there's something else that's holding up the schach, then it's kosher. And my tamo, in other words, if you have posts in the ground that the schach is on it, even though the bed frame is not affixed, I don't even care that the walls are easy to move. I want for that which supports the schach to be kavua. So as long as it's laying on something that's not makabel tuma, and it's going to be kosher. And guys, just to know the halacha, the bottom line is that b'diavad, we paskin that if a person, without knowing or not knowing, if a person built a sukkah, like we just mentioned, it's very common, all of these metal frame sukkahs, the metal pipes are items halachically that are susceptible to becoming tamei, then it's davar hamaymed. And lechatchila we paskin, put on top of the frame under the schach, bamboo sticks, other unfinished pieces of wood, or pshute klayet. You have to know the halachas, items that are not makabel tuma. Hold on a second. Isn't the frame holding up the bamboo that's holding up the schach? Yes, but that's called maimed de maimed. And we paskin that a maimed, the maimed is okay even lachatchil. But all of that, I mean, we're jumping from the Gemara until HaShulchan Aruch, but that's the source of the sugya, according to the Amoira that understands Pshat and Rabbi Yehuda, that the problem is you cannot put schach le Rabbi Yehuda on a davar that's mekabel tuma. To be continued.
Rabbi, if you only have a maimed and it's b'diavad, is the person yotze b'yodei chavasei?
Yes. We paskin.
We said that earlier.
Even though Rabbi Yehuda writes the words psula, and we learned on Daf Beis that the word psula is generally right at the beginning of the Masechta. Psula, unlike over there, to be mamayit by Eruvin, it means not good, but we don't paskin that it's not good b'diavad.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Shakayach for pointing out that detail about the sukkah. Thank you.
Oh no, I just want to say one more thing it's not that the schach cannot touch the metal frame. It cannot, you don't have to be that. Sometimes a touch doesn't matter. That it's primarily resting on the bamboo sticks or on something that's not makabel tuma that interposes enough.
Right, a piece of wood. Yeah.
Piece of wood is what everyone uses today.
Thank you for bringing down that halacha.